Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, and good to have you here. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Nima Hassan, Director of Somali NGO Consortium and Chair of IGFA Board. I'm your moderator for today. We'll get started just in a minute, but while we wait, I'd like to do a bit of housekeeping. If you need interpretation, please click on the globe icon at the bottom of your screen and select preferred language. You can choose from Spanish, French, and Arabic, and we have international sign language interpretation as well. We'd love to hear from you during the session. Please use the question and answers box to share your questions for the panelists. We'll do that towards the end of the conversation. The session is being recorded. We'll share the recording and materials afterwards. I'd like to welcome you to this event again, titled What Now for Inclusion? Navigating the New Era of Cuts and Resets. We are delighted you can join us for this timely and important conversation. As many of you know, the humanitarian sector is facing a period of profound change. Years of chronic underfunding for marginalized groups are now being compounded by brutal cuts, shifting donor priorities and structural reforms. Within this challenging context, there is a critical concern. The age, gender, disability, and other cross-cutting issues are being deprioritized or even excluded altogether. Let me start bluntly. The humanitarian reset, while clearly needed, risks becoming not a reset, but a rebrand. Why? Because the inclusion of affected population, national organizations, and even many INGOs remain an afterthought, not the foundation. Yes, reform is absolutely essential, and the goal to put people first is right. But to truly do that, we need more than a few narratives or a roadmap. We need a culture and power shift. If this reset doesn't change how power works, we'll simply repeat the same patterns under a new name, a new brand. And let's be clear, what holds back inclusion isn't just funding, it's who holds power, how decisions are made, and the willingness of senior leaders to share control. Three things stand out. First, the cuts. We've seen little change at the top. Most cuts are hitting middle management, P3 levels and below, and the very people who connect with the NGOs, communities, and policy work. Second, decisions, including the reset and the hyper-prioritization, are being made from top down, risking the exclusion of exactly that inclusion was meant to bring in. Yes, the cuts are a reality, but people's priorities must shape what's protected and what's scaled back. When decisions are made far from the people living with their consequences, exclusion is built on the system. A recent ground truth solution shows that clearly communities say participation is tokenistic. They ask, but they don't listen. That's a direct quote from the research. Inclusion isn't about feedback forms. It's about ensuring voices shape decisions that affect lives. Third, local organizations still lack the resources and spaces to lead, especially in coordination. Some NGO forums are included, but many aren't. The reset risks becoming another top-down transition without real engagement or planning. If we're serious about putting people first, then power must shift first. So today, we are not here to pat ourselves on the back for progress. We are here to call out the contradictions, to demand accountability, and to ask the tough questions. How can inclusion possibly thrive when the system itself keeps reinforcing exclusion? This is why we have brought together voices from across the sector to unpack what these funding and policy shifts really mean for marginalized and at-risk groups, and to talk honestly and openly about how we can push for humanitarian action that is truly inclusive, equitable, and grounded in justice. Without further ado, let me introduce my panelists. Start with Louise Atta, who is the Global President, Founder, and CEO of the Network of Women with Disabilities, and Founder and Executive Director of the Cedar Seed Foundation, a recognized diversity and inclusion expert, human rights advocate, and the first Black woman with disabilities named Young Global Leader of the World Economic Forum in 2017. She also serves on several boards within and beyond Nigeria. Ria Tariq is the Director of Global Impact at Help Age International, with over 20 years experience leading humanitarian and development programs across Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Middle East. Ria also serves as on the board of ELRHA. I think she might have to tell us what that is. And the DePaul International, and is a member of the START Network Membership Committee. I also have Sarah Pod, who is the lead policy specialist humanitarian aid at CEDA. She has over 20 years experience in the humanitarian field with extensive experience in protection policy. Before CEDA, she worked as head of the emergency thematic unit at Save the Children in Sweden. And prior to that, she worked with UNICEF in East Africa. And I also have the great Gemma Connell, who is the chief of the Strategic Prioritization and Practices branch for OCHA, where she oversees work related to humanitarian needs and assessments, appeals, and coordination. She has been with OCHA since 2011, and prior to which she worked with the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees in Gaza. And last but not least, Dr. Veronique Barbalet, who is an independent consultant and a research associate with the Humanitarian Policy Group at ODI. She is a senior analyst and a policy researcher with 18 years in research and policy influencing on humanitarian policy and practice, more specifically localization, gender and inclusion, and protection. So we have a great lineup of panelists for you, and I really look forward to this conversation, as I said, with open and honesty in addressing some of these hard questions that we need to ask. So let me start with Veronique. Could you give us an overview of the state of play on inclusion in humanitarian action today? Where has the progress been? What practices or approaches have enabled inclusion of at-risk groups, and where are the gaps? Over to you, Veronique.
Thank you so much, Nimo, for this introduction and for setting the scene for us. So let me give you a little bit of an overview of where the sector is. And I'm going to start with an overview prior to this year, prior to the funding cuts and the reset. So up to beginning of 2025, the sector had increasingly given more attention to leaving no one behind, and with a focus on marginalized groups, such as people living with disabilities, older persons, or minoritized communities. And this resulted from a lot of advocacy around the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016, but also with the Leaving No One Behind agenda of the Sustainable Development Goals, and with increasing evidence that unfortunately people were falling through the cracks of emergency responses. There is progress on inclusion and inclusive humanitarian action in the sector. However, this is not consistent across the board. We see that gender receives a lot more attention, and that's not to say that everything is perfect, but that is where there's been most of the progress, most of the investment, and most of the attention. More recently, we have seen much more investment in disability inclusion, and this has been supported in part by the Interagency Standing Committee guidelines on the inclusion of persons with disabilities in humanitarian action. There are still some challenges, but what we're seeing much more consistent disability inclusion reflected in humanitarian needs overview and response plans. We see improved data on disability prevalence, and we see an increased engagement with organizations of persons with disabilities. However, when it comes to inclusion of people with diverse sexual orientation, gender identities and expression, and sexual characteristics, of older persons, of youth, of ethno-linguistic minorities, these groups tend to trail far behind in the inclusion efforts. And this is what is often referred to as the hierarchy of inclusion, where you have much more investment attention on some aspects and where other aspects are really, really being left even further behind. And this is where the sector needs to still invest a lot more in analyzing the multiple layers of discriminations that occur in a crisis context so that humanitarians can move beyond this predominant focus on gender in their inclusion efforts. So with that progress, we've seen some good practices out there, which is great. And I'm going to point to them very quickly. I think some of my colleagues might put some of the links to some reports where we have a lot more examples of these good practices and with much more practical examples. So one good practice is where inclusion-focused international organizations like HelpAge, for example, where they are funded to support specific clusters or specific responses, then we've seen that this has led to much more inclusive humanitarian outcomes in responses. Where we have technical support at the organizational level, that also has been a very efficient way at shifting practice in humanitarian responses. And we've seen that, for example, with the World Food Programme working with CBM Global International Advisory Group, where the CBM Global International Advisory Group has lent expertise and technical support to the organization, and that has translated in a change in practice in humanitarian responses. Where you have funding and partnering with local and national organizations run by and for marginalized groups, that has been really essential for achieving more inclusive outcomes in crisis, as well as increasing the participation of these specific population groups. Of course, this requires addressing some of the challenges around locally led humanitarian action. And I'm not going to say a lot more. We have Lois on the panel who will be able to speak from that point of view a lot more and that experience. And finally, as I said, we are seeing increasingly much more data being collected in a disaggregated manner by age, sex, and disability status. And that has been really great and a very essential first step. However, we often overlook the investment needed in disaggregated analysis so that this data can really translate into inclusive programmings. So even before the current funding cuts, there were numerous challenges and barriers to making humanitarian action more inclusive. There is no agreed definition of what inclusive humanitarian action means. There is no clear policy commitments to inclusive humanitarian action generally. And there's no standardized way of measuring progress on making humanitarian action more inclusive. There is also a reluctance to engage with inclusion as it continues to be perceived as too political, too sensitive, and it raises concerns for some humanitarian actors around the principle of neutrality. Humanitarian responders we found also in the research that we've conducted over the years are feeling really overwhelmed by the growing number of guidance and requirements and requests put on them to be gender sensitive, to be conflict sensitive, to be disability sensitive, but also to make sure that they mainstream protection and they ensure the centrality of protection. And that has had a really difficult impact on the ability of responses to manage all of these demands on them. And we haven't found the solution yet. And then there continues to be a tension between the rights-based approach to inclusion and the needs-based approach of humanitarian action. And some organizations have solved this. For example, the International Federation of the Red Cross has adopted a rights-informed, needs-based approach to their work. And that's an example that others could follow. So coming to this year, and we've seen all this progress, which is not perfect, but it's progress on making humanitarian action more inclusive. But it is evident that increasingly this progress is fragile and under threat. First, as you said, Nemo, with the pressure to go back to basics, the prioritization, the funding due to the funding gaps, I see this as both a risk and an opportunity. It's a risk if prioritization is driven by, you might enact by assumptions around needs and vulnerabilities that focuses on the number of people reached rather than the quality and the equity of responses. But it could be an opportunity if prioritization is guided by stronger analysis and the drivers of need and focus on those that are disproportionately affected. The Humanitarian Policy Group at ODIHR Global recently published a couple of papers and policy briefs calling for the sector to use this ongoing humanitarian reset as an opportunity to foster more nuanced approaches and ensure that there is no going back to inaccurate notions of life-saving assistance that disprioritize inclusion and protection. And then second, and that will be my last point, I have my 1 minute. The second one is that with the funding cuts this year, we've also seen this the progress on inclusion being undone by the rise of extreme right-wing politics globally and the backlash on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Unfortunately, with the stop work orders that many of us received and the funding cuts with the UN was a call for all partners to cease all diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And unfortunately, we saw some international organizations reacting by quickly deleting all their reference to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So instead of watering down our collective ethics and morals, we can also act coherently, defending both the humanitarian principles we commit to as professionals and the ethics we uphold as human beings committed to solidarity with one another. So acting and advocating together to support those that are continuously pushed behind is also a humanitarian imperative. And I will leave you with that. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you very much, Veronique. You really highlighted. It's good to start with the positivity and the progress that we made as a sector, but you've also underlined that even within the minorities, there are you called it hierarchy of inclusion, hierarchy of inclusion. And it's really important that we unpack that and ensure that we're addressing these minority groups based on their needs and approaches. You've also mentioned that with our data analysis that has improved, but there's a gap on how that is operationalized and how that is analyzed. Let me actually quickly move forward and invite Ria to also give us a perspective on what does the funding picture tell us about the inclusion. It's being prioritized for older people and other marginalized groups. Remember, based on what already Veronique has said in the definition and the categorization of the individual excluded groups. And also, can you share a concrete example of where inclusion has been strengthened and where it's under real threat due to cuts and shifting donor policy, and any information on the impact on partners or risks to localization? Ria, over to you.
Thanks, Nemo. It's ironic that we have a hierarchy of inclusion, but Veronique has given us a broad state of play of the inclusion landscape, and I'll try and zoom in on the inclusion of older people. But let me start by setting the scene. The world around us is changing, populations are aging at an unprecedented pace. Today, we have 1 billion people who are over the age of 60. And when you fast forward it to 2050, that number is going to be doubled to 2 billion. That is 1 in 5 people globally will be over the age of 60. And what's even more striking is where this change will happen. Around 80% of older people will live in low and middle income countries facing conflict, poverty, climate crisis. And yet, all our research that we have done over the years shows the same pattern. The world is aging on one hand, but humanitarian priorities have not caught up. So if you take Ukraine, for example, older people make up about a third of those in need of humanitarian assistance. Yet, they were still not systematically included in the response. And this is not an isolated case. Today, HelpAge is releasing a report which really looks at the funding architecture, looks at funding for older people in humanitarian crisis, examines how humanitarian funding is addressing or not addressing or overlooking the rights and the needs of older people. So as a proxy, we took about project data from 12 countries, reviewing around 18,000 titles from OCHA's financial tracking service and another 6,000 project descriptions from the IATI database. And the results are alarming. Less than 0.1% of projects were even mentioned older people, and only 6% referenced them in broader programs. Now, this exclusion isn't accidental, it is structural. Older people are often missing from the very data that drives decision making. HelpAge did another piece of research, Out of Sight, Out of Mind, and that also highlighted that older people were left out of humanitarian needs overviews, response planned. And even when mentioned, the analysis was shallow and inconsistent. I mean, Veronique was talking about some good practice of having some data finally, but that data, that analysis is not used to design the programs. And the impact is greater for those facing multiple forms of exclusion. If you're an older woman and have disability and are displaced, your risks multiply and you become invisible because there's no data. The system is not designed to get that data. And when you're not counted, your needs or what you can contribute, it's totally absence. But there is hope and there is a path forward. And our report shows how donors can drive real change by funding sex, age, and disability disaggregated data, making it a requirement that embedding inclusion in funding is an absolute must, fostering collaboration across advocacy groups and dismantle all this hierarchy. It's not about choosing one over the other. And I think that's the kind of shift we need, because I think when inclusion is done right, everyone benefits. And from our own experience, we have seen some great examples on how it can be done. Over the years, HelpAge has been dispelling myths, raising awareness, advocating with governments, really wanting humanitarian actors to recognize older people not as a special group, but as part of affected population who have those equal rights, capacities, and leadership of their own. One major step forward was the humanitarian inclusion standards, and you will have a link in the chat. It was developed after years of consultation and field testing as a companion to Sphere standards, and mainly created because actors were asking a simple but critical question. So what do we need to do as a minimum to make our response inclusive? So these standards are practical. They show what needs to change in programs, systems, and most importantly, attitudes to make inclusion real. So that's one big resource we have. Alongside that, I know Veronique mentioned about the age inclusion specialists. We have been embedding these age inclusion specialists within humanitarian coordination systems, working directly with UN agencies, clusters, governments, NGOs, to ensure older people are no longer invisible in data. They're not an afterthought. They're part of assessments, they're part of planning, they're part of monitoring. And we have seen through that some tangible results. We have seen, for example, in Ukraine, older people now being represented in data, shaping response activities. But let me give you two quick examples. In Ethiopia, one of our inclusion specialists worked with the data teams to revise the needs assessment survey. And overnight, 6 times more older people were identified than before. And that one change shifted how needs were understood and how resources were allocated. Second example from Ukraine, I was there just 2 weeks ago, and this is a country where 1 in 4 people is over 60. We are talking about the world's largest humanitarian crisis affecting older people. So what did I witness? 2 things. One was the success of Asian Disability Working Group, which we set up back in 2014 under the Protection Cluster. Now, this working group is co-led by HelpAge inclusion specialists who have trained focal points in each cluster so that inclusion is built systematically into planning, coordination, and funding decisions. The second and most inspiring thing was the leadership, voice, and agency of older people. And not everything is about funding and resources. We often forget to acknowledge the communities and older people as a key resource. So Help Asian and Partners have supported dozens of peer-to-peer groups, all led by older people themselves. More than 300 older leaders who have been trained in communication and psychosocial support. And what do? They reach homebound older people to provide that peer-to-peer support on a voluntary basis. So having said that, the progress is fragile in that country with funding cuts. International agencies are now leaving. Government budgets are under strain due to the war. And definitely with the reset, inclusion is at risk of slipping off the agenda. But I think overall, if you look at what we have achieved the last decade and where we definitely are at that critical juncture. We have come a long way, but I think inclusion is under real threat from shrinking funding and shifting geopolitical tensions. Thank you. Back to you, Nimo.
Thank you very much, Ria. Really sobering and encouraging at the same time in your intervention. One thing that strikes me quite, really widely is that older people are too often invisible. And you mentioned a figure of one in 1,000 projects explicitly mentions older people. Otherwise, they're hidden within that, and I think that's a big concern. You've also mentioned that older people have agency. They shouldn't be invisible. We should look at the data. The data that we have is not being used when we're doing our project designs. So I think some really concrete examples on how we navigate this. You've also given in your last few remarks that the humanitarian reset might actually have given us a chance to ensure that we do things correctly, and when we do inclusion correctly and rightly, then everybody wins. So I think that's really important point to underline. So let me now turn to Gemma and look at what's happening in the coordination side of our system. Gemma, how have the reset and the resulting streamlining of coordination mechanisms affected inclusion work in practice? Any particular challenges or opportunities that have arisen that you've seen, and where does accountability for inclusive action to affected populations sit now? And then maybe some thoughts on what the shifts in prioritization. Is there any risk that some groups are being deprioritized under the current emphasis of life-saving and coverage? Over to you, Gemma.
Nimo, thank you so much. And apologies, colleagues, in case you can't see me, my video comes and goes. So I hope you'll see me soon. Let me kick off big picture, because I want to touch on something that was raised by Veronique, which is the question of whether or not we see a retrenchment from our collective commitment to diversity, to equity, to inclusion as we go through this period ahead. And I just wanted to reiterate something that our emergency relief coordinator, Tom Fletcher, said very recently on this exact issue, which is that we have to remain steadfast in our commitment to these values, and that we are no less committed to them based on individual election results. And I think that is an incredibly important starting point and framing for this discussion, and is what you will see certainly from our side as we try and go through this period ahead. So with that framing at the get-go, let me then come to what we're seeing, what this looks like in terms of the coordination space, but also the planning space and how we take things from here. What we're seeing is catastrophic, and I think we need to start with that reality, right? We are seeing a seismic contraction of humanitarian action. The actors that are hardest hit by that are local and national NGOs. And within local and national NGOs, the actors that are hardest hit are those that work on the issues that we're discussing today. A survey by UN Women just a few months ago found that 90% of the women organizations that they had studied had already been affected by the cuts this year. when the Disability Reference Group did a study in June, they found that 75% of responders had seen their work on disability inclusion already impacted. And we know that refugee-led and youth-led organizations have also faced incredible cuts in this period. So I just want to start by acknowledging that, because those cuts are incredibly dramatic and they are having an immediate, tangible impact on the organizations that have made the most progress of any of us on these issues. The second point that I would come to is a lot of what we've heard is around the technicalities, which are hugely important. The role of specialists, the role of data disaggregation, all of that is hugely important. But I do want to pick up on something that Veronique said. Humanitarians are exhausted. Humanitarians at every level of the system. And just to put this into context, we did a really quick stock take of guidance and indicators on different issues, and we found no less than 2,300 pages of guidance and over 200 indicators that humanitarians were intended to measure across these issues. So one of my challenges back to all of us is how we do this in a way that is meaningful, that is tangible, but that does not drown our colleagues who are delivering assistance each day in bureaucracy. And I think this is a challenge that we haven't quite yet gotten right. And it's something that in the humanitarian program cycle space, we have grappled with. And we actually came out with a statement that will pop in the chat box on data disaggregation, where we highlighted that we fully support data disaggregation. I think everyone who's spoken already has stressed that without data, we risk critical groups becoming not visible in a response. But equally, we can't collect that data and then do nothing with it, because that costs more for the people who we're asking to tell us about their lives and about their characteristics and about their identities, be that LGBTIQ plus people who might be telling us things that jeopardize their safety, be that people with disabilities who expect us to act on that. So one of the things we really stress is that when we collect this data, we have to ensure that it is feasible and appropriate in the context, that it is likely to be used. And one of the things we often see is, in fact, a gap between the needs analysis moment, when I acknowledge what everyone has said, that we have more and can do better, but we've come the furthest. But then we see this huge drop off between needs assessment and analysis and response planning in response monitoring. So we might collect that disaggregated information to inform the needs analysis, but by the time we get to monitoring whether or not the response is actually assisting those people in all of their diversities appropriately, we often have lost that by that moment. So what are the risks right now? What are we doing about it? Risk. I have heard colleagues talk about back to basics and concerns about what that means. I want to debunk a myth up front. Life-saving humanitarian action cannot, must not be equated with bad, poor quality, inequitable humanitarian action. The two are not the same thing. Life-saving literally means saving lives. That's something that we are all committed to as humanitarians. How we do that, we have a choice. Who we focus on, we have a choice. So life-saving must not become synonymous with bad humanitarian action. And we are able to define what it means. So just to say, in these past months, as we've had these excruciating conversations about prioritization, because we must, because collectively today, our global appeal is 21% funded. That is 40% less than it was funded at this time last year. 21% funded, we have to have excruciating conversations about who we focus on and what we aim to deliver. But we, as a humanitarian community, driven first and foremost by people's priorities and preferences, can choose what that looks like. It does mean we are going to be focusing on the people and places with the most severe need. It does, because we have an obligation to first reach those who are most at risk of dying. And that's part of what the principles say that we're founded upon. But it doesn't mean we should do that in a bad way. And I really want to stress that today. So I hear that risk, but I think it is something that we can avert. How can we avert it? many of you have spoken about people and priorities at the center. One of the things we've said for 2026 is let's look in every response over the course of the year at two things. Are we responding where the needs are most severe? Number one. Number two, are we responding in accordance with people's priorities and preference? And people here in all of their diversities. And this is something we've worked with HelpAge and other colleagues who are part of that work on the humanitarian program cycle to drive into the HPC. You will see this reference to inclusion, to diversity everywhere. And I really want to stress here that this is not about any one diversity. And it was interesting, Veronique, hearing about the hierarchy, but I will say we see risks of gender being erased right now as well. So we have to find a way to bring an intersectional approach to this that acknowledges the whole human of the people we serve in crises and does a far better job of delivering against what each of those people says they are prioritizing. The final point I'll make, Nimo, and I know I should stop shortly, is just to stress we have to do all of this with less money than we've ever had. That's going to mean difficult conversations. Those difficult conversations must be with the people we serve, not just with ourselves. That difficult conversation can look like acknowledging we only have this much money. What's the priority with that amount of money? But doing that in a way that ensures we are focused on quality, we are focused on inclusion, and above all of that, as an umbrella, we're focused truly on accountability. So Nimo, let me stop there. And again, just really appreciating this conversation at such a critical juncture for our sector.
Great. Thank you very much, Gemma. Yeah, I think you've absolutely highlighted lots of questions that, for me, what I really take away from your intervention is the how. We know what we want to do, but how do we do it? How do we ensure that we are reaching the most vulnerable, we're inclusive, and we're responsive with the limitation of the funding that we have? And I think that's where maybe there's subjectives in the approach there, the top down again, as opposed to level, bottom up. So I think we really need to get that balance right if we want to reach those who are, and those who need to get the balance right is those with power as well. And your statistics about the women survey that UN Women did, 90% women-led organizations who are addressing women issues are already impacted. 75% of those organizations with disability and inclusion activities have already been impacted. I think those are really sobering numbers, but how do we ensure that we are balancing, ensuring that we have a bottom-up approach and we're more inclusive in the resources that we have? And I think that's a big question that is for all of us here to discuss. Okay, let me swiftly move on. I think we might be running a little bit behind with time, so I'll keep my reflections to minimum, and we'll allow a bit more time for questions and interactions with our participants. So I'm turning to Sarah now. From a donor perspective, what role can donors play in keeping inclusion central to humanitarian responses, especially at a time of budgetary pressure? So doing less with less in a way. But what role can donors play? And then also maybe a bit of your reflections on what do you think would help enhance collaboration between different inclusion actors, particularly as space for protection work is shrinking, and any changes to coordination structures, changes to financial resourcing, donor backing, etc. So really wanted to hear from you on this and how we ensure we reach out the most vulnerable communities in the people we serve. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Nimo, and really thank you for inviting me to this discussion. I think it's really important to discuss how the reset can be this opportunity for a relevant and frank discussion, and how we together can work on the goal to create an efficient, dignified, and accountable system that not only offers assistance, but also that can mobilize capacities to protect people in crisis, and with the focus on those with the most severe needs of protection and assistance, no matter where or who they are. And I think there's the current rush to prioritize, rationalize, and prove value for money, which is completely understandable. But I think also that donors have a responsibility to demand and support partners in upholding rights, quality standards, considerations for diversity, equality, protection, safety, and inclusion. And that's very much related to the how. How do we do this without, and I recognize Gemma's comment on how many guidelines there are for humanitarian partners, but how can we work on this together? So I think these kind of discussions are really important. One of the things that I believe that donors can do and should continue to do is really to support and engage in the HPC, HNRP process on a global and context level. I think this process is really essential to allow the humanitarian community to identify and prioritize a quality, inclusive response. It's also relevant for targeting those with the most severe needs and even to facilitate coordination. We in Sweden, we see data and information as key enabler function for the quality response, and we are discussing with other donors how to address the gaps that are being identified. For these, we really need to maintain an open dialogue with you all to better understand the challenges, but also how we can support potential solutions. And I think we really understand the difficult choices that humanitarian actors have to do right now in the field. For example, I think we see a trend of more local actors being involved and collaborating in data collection, and I think this is really positive. However, we know that these organizations, as was mentioned, are also the ones that are really hit by the funding cuts, right? So this is something we need to keep our eyes on. So we have identified principled humanitarian resource allocation as one of our absolute priorities moving ahead. And we see this really as a way of reaching people with the most severe and acute needs. And we also promote protection risk analysis to be included and to steer the overall humanitarian response and to mitigate violence against affected vulnerable population. And I'm coming back to a point that several people have already mentioned. I think we as donors, we need to support and contribute to the understanding of vulnerability and layers of vulnerability. Among one thing that we can do is to make sure that we ask for data disaggregated by sex, age, and disability, that we know enhances effectiveness and appropriateness of interventions. But as it was also said, I think we sometimes ask for the data. We don't ask necessarily for how the data and analysis have been used to adopt programming. So I think that's something that we can be much better at. I think sometimes we are not asking because that would require to build our own capacity and also the capacity within our partners. We know that kind of shift in attitudes and ways of doing it requires capacity building, but it also requires a leadership that believes in this. We as donors can better align our requirements. We can synchronize reporting as much as possible. I think that's a little bit to make it easier to respond to all these demands. But we can also contributing by supporting and assisting in identifying ways to make humanitarian assistance and protection more effective, among other things via cash and vouchers, which I understand is also one way of promoting inclusion. And locally led action, community engagement, accountability to affected population. It's been mentioned, but I think that's really key and something that we really would like to do more of. And I'm sure we will hear it from Louise after, but really empowering local organizations, including women-led organizations, to be part of decision-making and coordinating forums in the humanitarian sphere. We believe that that's important. We believe it's important to give more direct funding as possible, engage in pooled funding, possibly steered by NGOs and local actors, advocate for equitable partnerships, etc. We also believe that core and flexible funding is important to allow for our partners to steer the response towards those with the most acute and severe needs, no matter who or where they are. And also that donor backing is important, not only via funding, but through discussions and dialogue. I think we need to continue to ask questions, engage in ongoing reform, promote inclusive platforms of collaboration, decision-making and coordination, among other things, through local actors. And we need to request meaningful community dialogue throughout the program cycle, and the use of feedback mechanisms and analysis for efficient programming. I think it was Veronique who talked about the tokenistic feedback mechanisms that doesn't necessarily need to change in how we work. And we need to find common platforms to work together. There are several donor initiatives. We are leading a protection donor group. Finland is leading discussions on disability, etc. I think we need to come together and push for collective efforts. And finally, I just want to make a short comment, which I think hasn't been made already. I think we need to improve collaboration and learnings from development actors. Development actors has since a long time worked on using a human rights-based approach, improve inclusion of the most vulnerable. And I think we can increase collaboration and learnings. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Yeah, I think thank you for that. And I think what I'm hearing from almost all the speakers is that we know what we need to do, but it's how do we do that? How do we ensure that we are responsive to the community? How do we know that the community themselves are the driving force of change and not an invitee to the table or are leading the coordination models? And there's a need for structural change that needs to take place if we need to correct and ensure that we have a more inclusive humanitarian action that fits in with this new geopolitics and landscape, and also with the funding landscape. And it's really important to also ensure that where does accountability sit as well? Is it the top or the bottom? Is it accountability to community, accountability to donors, and how do we balance the both? But I really take your points on better use of the data. Once we do have a data, then that data has to be made use. These layers, looking at the layers of vulnerabilities, having better segregated data. So a lot of it is coming back to the data. And your last point on better collaboration between the development actors and the humanitarian actors, I think this is really important in getting that, the dreaded word of nexus, getting that right as we go on this journey of resets. And let me invite, with that said, to our last speaker, Luis. Turning back to you, you've heard what the other panelists have said, what's already been raised, and really wanted to hear your thoughts on what role have local organizations and affected populations played in pushing for more inclusive approaches. What do you see as the biggest barriers and the most promising solutions to sustaining inclusion locally? So maybe the how, maybe Luis can tell us the how on how we do this, but no pressure on you. Please share your perspective with us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Nimo. My name is Lois Auta, and I'm from Network of Women with Disabilities. Yes, for us in Nigeria, we are over 25 million persons with disabilities. And so far, as women and girls with disabilities, we are triple jeopardized. First, as a woman, secondly, as a woman with disability, and lastly, the barriers. Local organizations and affected people push for inclusion by providing unique insight into local needs, acting as trusted intermediaries between communities, policymakers, institutions, and also mobilizing emotional empowerment and community action. And how can we advocate for systemic change and equitable rights and the rights for resource distribution among citizens? How can we co-govern the initiatives, the ideas, the agenda, the projects, and all the activities to ensure positive representation and social justice among persons with disabilities, especially women? We need to make sure that their engagement is crucial by developing an effective, tailored programs, inclusive initiatives, and building a lasting, inclusive societies. How can we provide local context and bridge the gaps? Are we bridge builders or barrier breakers? Which one are we? In-depth local knowledge. We need to make sure that local organizations and community members prioritize critical knowledge of their context-specific needs. The power of dynamics and the unique challenges faced by marginalized and vulnerable groups, which include persons with disabilities, the elderly, pregnant women, young people, children, and other set of people. And those intermediaries we're talking about, how trusted are they? These groups often maintain stronger, more trusted relationships with affected people, enabling them to act as effective conduits for information and resources between communities and external agencies. And when it comes to mobilization and empowering communities, how do we empower them? We have emotional empowerment, capacity building, and so on. We need to mobilize resources from the grassroots to the national level and globally, so we could ensure that everybody is carried along. And when we advocate for systemic change, we also need to prioritize amplifying voices and challenging injustice. This will make sure we improve and promote inclusive governance by co-creation and co-governance involving local actors in decision-making processes, communities, and their representatives can shape governance models that are more responsive to diverse needs and promote authentic social justice and inclusion. We also need to ensure that resource allocation are divided equally. Equitable resource allocation is key in working with local actors. And when we talk about the barriers which I mentioned in my opening statement, what are these barriers? attitudinal barriers, the myths and the misconceptions, the unconscious bias, the stereotypes, and the structural barriers such as inaccessible buildings, infrastructures, churches, mosques, offices, parks and gardens, and so on. We need to come up with solutions that involve raising awareness on the rights of citizens with disabilities. We need to challenge the status quo and all the biases. We also need to invest in accessibility and universal design. That's what we want to see. We need to promote community-led initiatives and trust. We also need to train our local NGOs so they could improve their capacity and adopt person-centered approaches in ensuring inclusive practices and tailored local needs. We also need to make sure that professional development and training are prioritized in staff education, local government, and other sectors to improve inclusive teaching methods, communication skills, and awareness of diverse needs. Whenever I'm speaking, I always ensure I discuss about stories of myself and my colleagues or my friends. I will never forget when one of my friends was pregnant. She went for antenatal. She was well attended to. On her way out of the hospital, she fell down from her wheelchair on the staircase. And that was how she lost her pregnancy. And the second one was communication barrier. I just discussed about infrastructural barrier. Communication barrier was when Fatima also attended antenatal clinic during COVID-19. And an announcement was made that today they were not going to attend to any other patient aside from COVID-19 patients. And because she didn't go with a sign language interpreter, she did not hear the announcement. She kept on sitting down to be attended to. And that was how she wasted over an hour waiting before she wrote down a note and gave to the receptionist. And the receptionist responded by writing. And that was how she missed that very day opportunity for her antenatal. This is so sad. She has the right to be attended to, no matter her status, no matter her disability. Women and girls with disabilities should be well attended to in every area of their lives. So for solutions, we need to prioritize funding opportunities for women with disabilities-led organizations. And existing social, economic, and political inequalities should be removed from the lives of persons with disabilities. We also need to make sure that policies are inclusive. Nigeria is at the verge of reviewing her 1999 constitution. And there's a bill for reserved seats for women and women with disabilities. Our organization was lucky to advocate for a 5% reservation of seats for women with disabilities. And that was added in the reviewed document. So we need donors to support initiatives by women and girls with disabilities. We need training and retraining. We need to ensure everywhere is accessible. for all the vulnerable groups. And we need more of partnerships and collaboration. So before I leave, I want to stretch on the following P's: moving away from problems to partnerships, from partnerships to possibilities, and from possibilities to prosperity. And we shouldn't forget this. This is very important. We should move from exclusion to inclusion, and from inclusion to participation, and participation to representation in every sector. And we also need to move from policy to practice and declarations to delivery. Thank you very much, ODI Global, for giving me the opportunity to speak on behalf of women and girls with disabilities. Thank you, Nimo, and everyone who contributed to the success of this event. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. Thank you. That's such an inspirational remarks, and I really won't do justice by recapping what you've mentioned, but just maybe to thank you for sharing those personal experiences to ensure that this is lived reality. This is people's lives and not policy and not rhetoric that we're discussing. So thank you for bringing it back to the reality. And all of the suggestions that you make and made resonates with all of us, and I'm sure with a lot of our listeners on the call as well. Maybe if I could just say one thing, is that the barriers and the exclusion is actually structural, is within and embedded within the system. And unless we change that from the system, I think our ambitions and aspirations will not be realized. So the real change needs to happen within the system that enable exclusion. Thank you for that. So as we're going to wrap up soon, I've got one final question for the panelists. And as we sort of tackle that question, could I please ask the participants to post their questions through the Q&A box as well. So one last question, and I really don't mind doing this in any order. Well, maybe we'll start with the earlier speakers because they've been listening for a while. Question is, how can affected populations themselves be more actively involved in shaping and leading on inclusion priorities in the future? So one or two actionable recommendations from each of our panelists, and I'll start with Veronique.
Yeah, I'm not going to go too much into it, but it's the magical triangle of inclusion, localization, and accountability. That's how I would say it. So if you make accountability local and inclusive, if you make inclusion local and accountable, and if you make localization inclusive and accountable, then you will have that. And I think to describe it more practically, having organizations like the organization Lois is heading, organizations that are membership organizations that are run by and for very specific groups is one of the best way forward to make sure that these voices are heard. But they need to be funded, they need to be given the space, and they need to be listened and trusted with what they bring forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Veronique. Ria.
Thanks, Nimo. I think the real shift we need to make is to kind of move from that beneficiary mindset to a partnership mindset. And what I mean is, we heard different speakers talk about the resources are limited, we have endless guidelines. I think we need to partner with the communities, have that partnership, start those conversations, because I think inclusion isn't something we do for people, it's something we find solutions together with them. So I think that for me is the first step, so that they are part of the design and planning. It's not a tokenist consultation. We are actually moving from consultation to co-leadership, where we have seen in some parts where older people are included, they are acting as advisors or community focal points. They are not just recipients of aid. So moving to that stage. And I think something that the last speaker also talked about was accessibility. I think one of the biggest barriers we see is some of the marginalized groups don't always have the accessible information, the right tools. So when you don't know what the rights are or how to provide feedback, you can no longer participate in the same way as somebody who is able. So I think it's about really understanding what's stopping people from being included and making sure that accessibility is part of our thinking. And I think lastly, I'd say that it does come to political will. And I think Sarah was talking about collaboration. But I think it's about, as a sector, we've been talking about inclusion for the last couple of decades. And I mean, maybe I'll go back to what Veronique said in the beginning. Do we really know how to measure the change? We have shifted the dial for sure. But how do we know we have made the change? Because we are going from one project to one response to one organization to one cluster. So what is moving? And I think we do need to evidence that as well, because that's not happening as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing those reflections. Gemma.
Great. I want to reinforce what Veronique said about the support to organizations for specific groups. I think it's critical. I want to reinforce what Rhea said about a partnership mindset with communities. And when we speak about prioritization, I just want to stress this is really about having those difficult conversations with communities, right? The difficult conversation doesn't happen in an isolated room. It is had as a discussion with communities around what their priorities are with the limited resources that are available, because that limited resource piece is a reality. And I just want to add two more, Nimo. One is multi-purpose cash. Multi-purpose cash gives an individual the ability to decide what they, their family, their community needs. And in that way, it can actually help build dignity, not build dignity. People have dignity, but it restores that dignity by choice. It can build inclusion and it can reduce social exclusion. And that is all proved with respect to multi-purpose cash. So it is a modality that I think is really critical to bring into this conversation. There was a question around how we ensure that intersectional approach and giving people the choice about how they use the resources given to them is one of the most concrete ways we can do this. My last comment, Nimo, how do we do this at a time of such resource scarcity? We've spoken to the incredible role of local actors, but their funds have been cut. We've spoken to the incredible role of volunteer networks and I think that Lois said this so well, as trusted interlocutors with communities. How do we ensure that that piece remains so solid and so firm right now? Because the fear and the risk we're seeing is partners are all telling us we have no money to do the most minimum, let alone more. We prioritize this and we do it with the trusted interlocutors who are so best placed to do it. Thank you. Back to you, Nimo.
Great, thank you. And I really think we need to be saving those interlocutors that trusted, who connect us with the local communities, who have the knowledge, who have the skills, really important for us to look back on how we prioritize our own individual organization operations as well. Sarah.
Thank you, Nimo, but I really think most of what is really needed to be done has been said. I think really we as a donor, what we can continue to push for is really locally led action and community-led action, promote, fund inclusive platforms for collaboration, decision-making, and coordination to ensure that affected people are also included and listened to.
Great, thank you. And Luis, just 2-3 lines of key call to action on how communities can be affected populations can engage in and shape and lead the inclusion priorities in the future.
Okay, we need to work on decentralization, devolving decision-making processes to local authorities, enabling them to respond to local needs and priorities. We also need to leverage on the power of technology and innovation. Leveraging technology will help us to enhance access to information, services, and opportunities for marginalized groups. And we shouldn't forget to also mentioned M&E. Doing that will establish robust monitoring and evaluation systems that helps to track progress and identify areas for improvement. That being said, we shouldn't forget the 4 E's, which are engagement, education, empowerment, and enablement. If we focus on these 4 E's, it will bring development and growth to the local communities. Thank you very much.
Again, thank you very much. Really excellent. Maybe just to add a few, emphasize and reiterate as well, in addition to what you've said, and I really like the points on leveraging on technology and innovation, which we've not discussed so far in this conversation, which is really, really important. I mean, the whole technology is changing, and we really need to be, that may be one way of providing access to providing access and improving inclusion, but also to ensure that we don't see affected population as beneficiaries, as passive, but really that they are leaders and decision makers, and we enable them to be part of those genuine decision-making platforms. Inclusion requires shifting power. Really, if we don't tackle the power and the power imbalance, I don't think the needle will move on inclusion and ensuring that we have a more locally led response. So not consulting them, not just getting feedbacks, but ensuring that they're part and parcel of our decision-making and allocation of resources, affecting, influencing policy change as well. Sarah, I think you mentioned advocating for funding that must flow directly to local actors and ensuring that we put the funding mechanisms that will enable donors to directly fund those truly on the ground. And then again, a couple of you mentioned this, there needs to be a co-design, co-governing, co-budgeting on humanitarian action, and true accountability demands transparency in funding flows. I think I mentioned this as well, that we need to challenge and ensure that the structural barriers are addressed if we really want to ensure that we have a true level of locally led response. And then looking at the cultural, organizational cultures and how we deliver as well, I think that's really important, and ensuring that leadership shares authority and embraces dissent, especially if there's critiques that are coming into the system. It's not seen as dissent, but it's not seen as a threat, but seen as a valuable addition to how the system must change. And I really want to echo the ICFA call for all NGOs and UN agencies to publish their data. I don't think where there's so much secrecy in the data, in the funding flows. We really need to be more transparent in how that is delivered. Well, thank you so much to the panelists for the excellent interventions. Just quickly going to turn into some of the questions that are coming from the participants. So I have the first question, and I think this could go to Veronique and maybe Gemma, because it's looking at data. To what extent is all the guidance, disaggregated data, etc., actually helping us to see where people face multiple risks and are at risk of at the intersection of multiple vulnerabilities? For example, an older person, maybe LGBTQ+, maybe displaced and have disability. How can we get better at addressing complex needs holistically? So maybe, I'd say see if Veronique and Gemma could try and address this question.
Thank you so much, Nimo. That's a very complex one, and I have worked on a few consultancies with different organizations and donors on looking at intersectional approaches, so where you're really trying to look at these intersections, and it is very complex. I think the first one that's really important and where it's been really difficult, and it also links a little bit to another comment that's in there, that unfortunately what's really difficult with this situation is that it's not, if you want, intersection is not adjective, and it's not like, oh, if you have an expert who is LGBTQI plus, but also is an expert on older age, who is also an expert on disability inclusion, here you are, you put them in a room, they can help that person. The complexity of these coming together create very specific types of barriers and challenges, as well as opportunities, which mean that it's really hard to address these very specific vulnerabilities. And I saw Gemma answered already in the Q&A, which is great, around multi-purpose cache, which can be great, but I think in some instances, and it's great in the sense that it's often in line, it's a dignified response and often in line with what people are asking in terms of their preference. The problematic with it, and we've seen it in some places, is that sometimes the discrimination, the marginalizations for these people is so high that they don't even get to the first step in the door to know that this exists, to be able to get identified by whoever is giving that multi-purpose cache. And actually what we found has worked quite well in some responses is really using that protection tool of the case management. And that works really well when you have specialized organizations. For example, in that case, if you had an LGBTQI plus organizations as an entry point to look at that complexity through a case management approach, that's probably where you would have really good way of addressing that complex need and that complex vulnerabilities. I wanted to say a word of caution, and something that we've talked about and something that Gemma brought in as well, around, we're not talking about reducing the quality and the equity of responses. I just want to say, before the funding cuts, reach, scales, number of people reach is what was seen as success. With the funding cuts, I don't see that measure of success going down. I see it going up. So if we continue to allow the sector to be measured by success, that's on how many millions of people are reached, which I understand why we do, because crises are huge and do require scale. I completely understand. But when you're doing a protection case management approach, you're not looking at the thousands, the tens of thousands. You're looking at the hundreds for an organization that maybe is an LGBTQI plus organization. So we need to really balance this need for scale, which we all understand why it's there, but not think of it as being the success and how we measure success, and really think about how we have much more deeper, more complex responses that really, really go to that quality and equity. Sorry, I've been speaking for too long. I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. I think you addressed that, and I will say to Gemma, maybe respond if you have additional response through the chat. We don't have much time, so I've got one more question that I want to go to Sarah, and then we will need to wrap up. I apologize, but I'm asking the team to respond if possible through the chat as well. So Sarah, maybe this question to you, reflecting on shifting the power. There have been some great ideas shared for how this could happen, but I see a tension between the long-term investment in behavior and system change, financial resources and energy needed to make these structural changes, and the current system, which is focused on rapidly immediacy and is largely judged by the total number of people reached. Any ideas on how to address this tension? It's a really big and complex question, but maybe you can have a go, Sarah, and then we'll see if we've got more time for others to come and contribute. Sarah, over to you.
Thank you, Nimo. It is a complex question, but allow me to build a little bit on Veronique's comment. I think if we measure success only in how many people we have reached with certain assistance, there is a big tension. But if we allow ourselves to look at how many people reach, that's also important. We need to have a response at the scale, but some of the responses, including protection responses, may have to be measured in another way, which is more qualitative, which is we are meeting the immediate needs, but we are also mitigating new humanitarian needs to arise, right? If we manages to help a certain number of people that will also get out of the need of humanitarian assistance. That's also important. So I think it is about how do we measure results? How do we see a success? And that needs to be changed. We can not only count numbers, we also have to look at how can we measure results in more qualitative ways.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think also this, you've mentioned it before, Sarah, if we improve the collaboration between development actors and humanitarian, this maybe will help us to address the long term while we're addressing the short term response as well. So I think that's something we need to do better. And I always think maybe the donors have a little bit more responsibility in this. And the reason why I say that is because the funding envelopes that partners address and speak to come in different envelopes from the donor. So I think if that changes and it's even housed within the same location, maybe then we would be in a better position to address that as well. So I think even the funding mechanisms play a role on how to look towards the future, but also ensure that we're addressing the immediate needs and the life saving that we need to do as humanitarians. I think if we can get that balance right, then maybe we will see a change in the system.
Absolutely, Nimo. And I think we do have, as donors, a responsibility to bring actors together and share the analysis, the data that we have, bring actors together around how do we solve not only the immediate needs, but also the long-term drivers of humanitarian needs.
Yeah,
thank you, Nimo.
Great. Thank you so much. There are a couple of other questions. I think the panelists are already responding to it in the chat box. I've been lucky enough to be given some wrap up and final remarks highlighted. So I'll just go through them and read through them as I have them. But also I have one call to action and one question to my co-panelists, but also to the participants. So bear with me a second as we've got 9 minutes left. So I really want us to stay within the time limit as well. So some of the highlights from our conversation today, very rich, very diverse, and it's really great having all women, powerful women on this panel as well. So really who have given us so much to think through, to take it forward to our own work and our own organizations. But progress is, the highlights are progress is fragile. With the reset, there are risks that inclusion could slip off the agenda, but we could also be opportunity. Prioritization is guided by strong analysis, importance of not just collecting data and doing nothing with it, but need the analysis to actually understand the impact. Numbers, coverage are not the only measures of success. Life-saving must not be equated with bad, poor quality, inequitable humanitarian action. There will be difficult conversations, of course, there are difficult conversations that are happening internally in organizations, but also between the interagency as well. The need to have those conversations with people themselves. Absolutely. I think we're really busy in looking at the internal system and structures, and we're not having those regular conversations with the communities that we are serving. So that's really important messaging. And then, the conversation has to be in a way that ensures that we are focused on quality, inclusion, and accountability. Needs to bring an intersectional approach that acknowledges the whole human. Local organizations provide local context and bridge the gaps. They bring unique insights into experience. They have trusted relationships with the affected population, and they are effective conduits for information and resources. And the call to support local organizations to adopt a person-centered, support local organizations to adopt a person-centered approaches. Exclusion to inclusion in partnerships and in participation. The need to improve collaboration and learning from development actors. Really a lot of information to take away from this conversation. I won't read everything that I've been given because the time is limited, and I really want us to get through this challenging question that I want to pose to you as the panelists, but also to the participants. The question is, and the challenge to you is, what commitment are you going to make to incorporate or maintain and enhance the inclusive approach to your work? So what are we committing to individually, and how do we influence our organizations? So what commitments are you going to make to incorporate or maintain and enhance inclusive approach to your work? I'll start with myself. I commit to using every platform I hold to challenge close decision making and ensure that those most affected are equal partners, not guests, in leadership and funding. So I commit to advocate for that message. And I want to leave you this challenge with you. What will you commit? What will your commitment be? How will you use your influence to share power, embedded inclusion, and to turn words into action? True change depends on each of us choosing to lead differently. So that is my challenge to you. And I maybe quickly just to ask one or two. I think I'm gonna ask my local active representative Lewis, and then I'm going to ask the donor. I'm gonna ask UN OCHA Chema just to give me their personal commitments on what they want to do. So maybe Sarah, you go first.
I commit, thank you, Nimo. I commit to continue to engage in dialogue with our partners and our other donors, but also to as much as possible ensure that we have representative from local actors and affected population present.
Excellent. Gemma.
I think the biggest commitment I can make is that this isn't seen to be overwhelming or not doable, right? In a system that's in seismic contraction, in a system where everyone is exhausted and overwhelmed and partners are closing and offices are closing, etc., that this is seen to be doable, that we reiterate that every day, that we talk about, as you just said, Nimo, the practical ways that this can be done and the evidence that it is possible. I think that's one of the biggest commitments, that it's not seen to be overwhelming, that it's seen to be doable, and that we do it. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Lewis, I'll let you have the last word, and I'm sorry to miss out Veronique and Rhea, but the commitments are to you as well on what you do within your organization on a personal level. Lewis? Can you hear me? Or maybe not. Oh yeah, maybe not. Okay. No. Okay. We've got 3 minutes left. I've got a few closing remarks to say. Then maybe I will invite Rhea, as your position as your director of Help Age. What is your commitment? What's your personal commitment?
Thanks, Nimo. I think Help Age has been on a journey of trying to convince stakeholders for the last many, many decades. So I think I commit to keep advocating, keep challenging the system, collaborate with key stakeholders, raise awareness. But most importantly, what I take away from this conversation is we really need to have more evidence of what effective inclusion looks like and highlight the real costs of exclusion. So I think that's something I commit. Thank you.
No, that's really important. Highlight the cost of exclusion. I think that's really important and powerful message to say, to highlight as well. And I think earlier on you said if we get inclusion right, then we get the response right. So I think we need to keep on repeating that message, and rather the vulnerable communities not being an afterthought to when we're designing the projects and not only appear in our projects, but really be part and parcel of our response. I really wanted to thank you all for joining us today and for all your contributions. We really appreciate your time and engagement. And we'll be sharing the recordings after this event by the event page on the ODI website and by email. You will also be able to find the reports mentioned by our panelists in the chat and on the events page as well. You can find the email addresses of the co-organizers, Help Age International and Humanitarian Policy Group in the chat box as well. I hope already my colleagues have put those contacts in there. Please do follow up with questions or comments. And I really want to give my sincere appreciation to our panelists, Luis, Veronique, Sarah, Rhea, and Gemma. And huge thanks to our interpreters. And I'm really sorry if we were too fast for you, for making today possible. Let's keep the conversation going. Let this be the beginning of a real change, an equitable change for our affected population and those who serve them in the front lines, but also for these specific groups that we spoke about and we discussed today, and looking at it from all the different angles that we can support. So thank you very much for joining us, and have a good day. Bye.